they owe Californians an apology for this, and we want to ensure this doesn't happen again. So,
Well, I didn't mention this at the offset, but we did invite Volkswagen, and we invited the United States EPA, and we invited the California Department of Justice, and they each declined to participate. And one of the reasons is because anything publicly said right now by any of the parties at such a sensitive point in the negotiations may tweak it. So although the California Department of Justice hasn't filed a lawsuit, and they represent the CARB and all the other state agencies here, because of the possibility of litigation separate from the federal US EPA and the investigation that's ongoing and the negotiations, I guess they stayed in Germany. No, they just decided not to come to the hearing. So that's I think those discussions are going on outside our committee. Mr. Todd Sachs.
Thank you. Part of keeping this from happening again is having a strong and effective enforcement program. And through our enforcement efforts, we will hold Volkswagen accountable for their illegal actions. Our enforcement efforts are focused in 4 areas: investigating the facts, fixing the vehicles, mitigating the harm caused by excess emissions, and assessing penalties. Today, I will discuss the status of our investigation and next steps as we move forward to resolve this case. Once VW admitted to the defeat devices, CARB initiated an enforcement proceeding. The first step in that proceeding is to investigate the facts and determine the range and scope of violations. We issued a notice of violation for the 2-liter vehicles on January 12th, which identified 13 violations of state law. Broadly stated, VW intentionally misrepresented key facts in its applications and used defeat devices. These actions resulted in the sale of vehicles that were not the same as what was certified, and as a result, all of these vehicles sold by Volkswagen are illegal. We have not yet issued a notice of violation for the 3-liter vehicles covered by CARB's in-use compliance letter issued in November of 2015. Our investigation into these vehicles is ongoing. The second step we are taking in this case is to fix the vehicles in question. In California, there are over 82,000 vehicles equipped with defeat devices, including more than 66,000 2-liter vehicles and more than 16,000 3-liter vehicles. These vehicles were manufactured since the 2009 model year and employed 3 different generations of technologies. These vehicles may emit up to 40 times more NOx emissions than the levels to which the vehicles were certified. The level of excess emissions is specific to each generation of vehicle technology. The first generation, those manufactured between 2009 and 2013, have the highest emission rates and have been on the road the longest. Excess emissions caused by the use of defeat devices are a serious public health issue. Our goal has been to fix the vehicles and return them to their certified configuration as expeditiously as possible. Unfortunately, this may not be possible. Since issuing the first in-use compliance letter for the 2-liter vehicles, CARB and EPA have been evaluating technical information and testing data and have been in discussions with Volkswagen to determine if vehicles could be fixed to meet certification and OBD requirements. VW was unable to assemble a recall plan that met requirements established by law and regulation, and on January 12th, we rejected their recall plan. Since that time, we have continued discussions with Volkswagen and with EPA to determine if and to what extent the vehicles can be fixed. Our discussions with Volkswagen and with EPA are continuing. As of today, we do not believe any of the 3 generations of vehicle technologies for the 2-liter vehicles can be repaired to meet their certified emissions levels or OBD requirements. The third step we are taking in this case is to quantify excess emissions and to mitigate the past and ongoing harm caused by the vehicles in question. We are developing an estimate of the excess emissions already caused by these vehicles. The estimate will take into account the number of vehicles, annual vehicle usage, emission factors based on test results from CARB and other organizations, and other types of information. Several recent academic studies have suggested Volkswagen 2-liter vehicles have emitted roughly 50,000 tons of NOx emissions nationally above their certified levels between 2009 and 2015. About 15% of all Volkswagen vehicles sold nationally were sold in California. These studies were based on limited testing data available publicly. While these studies provide an initial excess emissions estimate, we are currently testing additional vehicles to better understand the emissions characteristics of each technology generation over the road, to better quantify and refine excess emissions estimates in California. Volkswagen should mitigate all of the excess emissions they have caused. A number of principles guide our thinking as we consider potential mitigation options. We believe mitigation projects should have a nexus to air quality, mobile sources, and passenger transportation in particular. We believe mitigation projects should be transformative, consistent with California's mandates and goals for zero-emission vehicles. And we believe mitigation must address social equity issues by benefiting disadvantaged communities. Potential mitigation concepts will be addressed in the context of any settlement discussions that may occur. CARB is considering all options that provide quantifiable and equitable mitigation and preserve the integrity of our program. The final step we are taking in this case is to assess penalties. It is premature at this point to speculate on what potential penalties may be assessed or when the penalty issue will be resolved. Once we have identified the range and scope of violations and the magnitude of harm caused by the violations, we will determine appropriate penalties. In addition to the direct emissions mitigation, a portion of any settlement monies collected may be applied to supplemental environmental projects that provide funding for new or existing environmental projects in California. We are evaluating several options to achieve the objectives of fixing the vehicles, mitigating past and any potential future harm, and penalizing Volkswagen, while also attempting to provide consumers with flexibility. One option would be to require Volkswagen to buy back all of the vehicles that cannot be brought into compliance. This option could be disruptive for consumers, and some consumers have indicated to us they would like to keep their vehicles. Another option would be for Volkswagen to fix the vehicles to something less than full compliance. If this is an option, Volkswagen would need to pay to mitigate the harm caused by allowing these vehicles to continue to operate on the road. At this point, we are continuing discussions with Volkswagen and with the US EPA. We are hopeful Volkswagen will want to settle the case, but we are preparing to litigate if a settlement is not reached. This litigation will be complicated because it is part of a broader set of civil claims that have been and will be brought by many different types of complainants against Volkswagen. For example, when the scandal broke last fall, more than 450 class action lawsuits were filed for consumer, environmental, and other claims across the United States. Lawsuits were filed on behalf of citizens and states. In December, all of these cases were consolidated into a single multi-district litigation in the Northern District Court of California in San Francisco under Judge Charles Breyer. On January 4th, 2016, US EPA filed a complaint against Volkswagen for the 2-liter and 3-liter vehicles in the Federal District Court in Detroit, Michigan. This case was subsequently transferred to San Francisco as part of the multi-district litigation. On February 25th, 2016, Judge Breyer ordered Volkswagen to produce a plan for fixing the vehicles by March 24th to the court in San Francisco. The judge issued this order because every day these cars remain on the road, more excess emissions are released, and consumer complaints are not addressed. Because CARB and EPA must approve any Volkswagen plans to fix the vehicles before a fix may be initiated, any potential resolution to the consumer, environmental, and other claims in the multi-district litigation depends on potential CARB and US EPA decisions on how to handle the illegal vehicles. As a result, we are taking a measured approach in our decisions. California has not yet filed a legal action for either the 2-liter or 3-liter vehicles because we want to keep our options open, and it may be most appropriate to file in state rather than federal court. We are being guided by the California Attorney General's office in this matter. Before closing, I would like to note that while the Volkswagen case has left a black market on light-duty diesel technologies, diesel vehicles can be a part of a compliant fleet mix. Diesel emission control technologies are effective when used properly. We will be instituting changes to our processes to identify non-compliant vehicles that will better ensure this is in fact the case. Other manufacturers need to understand that any potential cheating will be caught and lead to serious repercussions. That concludes our testimony. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss this important issue. We would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
So clean diesel still exists. We're good to hear that. Senator Hill, you had your hand up first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess what I'm struggling with is, we're talking about in California with 80,000 vehicles almost. And they are right now driving, they're violating the law, they are polluting, yet this process could go on for years before there's resolution to it. I know there's a court, they have to come up with a plan, but they'll challenge that, and we could be talking many years. But if my gas engine that I have that fails a smog check, I won't get a registration for that vehicle. And that vehicle will not be able to drive on a California street. So, and that was my point. This is not the driver's or the vehicle owner's fault, but it would be nice to solve that problem in a way that would allow the vehicle owner to be protected or to provide some alternative to keep that vehicle off the road, but require VW to make that whole and work.
So I would see. So a couple of things. First, you're absolutely right. These vehicles are illegal. Continuing to have them operate on the road is a bad thing. It is certainly an option that because these vehicles are illegal, we could and would be within our rights to choose to not allow these vehicles to continue to operate on the road. But we are concerned about consumers in addition to our responsibility for the environment. And so as part of any potential discussions that we have with the company, we are looking at options where the vehicles could potentially be fixed, and that there would be some, that would be part of a broader deal that would provide the type of compensation that you're talking about. But we are going to need to work through those issues and figure it out, and it will take some time.
Yeah, and to me, that's the problem, is the time that's involved and the years that could go on before this is resolved. And the consumers, the vehicle owners are obviously polluting, and I'm sure they don't want to do that, and yet they're not getting resolution to their issue. And I don't know if there's just as we have, the programs to help those who can't afford to repair their vehicles that fail smog check, I just don't know what the cost would be, and then recover that from VW at some point in time. But I don't know if it's just a struggle that it seems very difficult to resolve it. But just to continue it, I think is very unfortunate.
We are trying to make every effort we can to get these vehicles off the road as quickly as possible.
Thank you.
But in any event, you're talking about they would have never passed the certification on the front end, if whatever that fix is, right? I thought your testimony was that they couldn't repair them to do what they said they were going to do, but they could have done some other, only polluting 2 times as much, or whatever, not 40 times as much.
So so it is clear to us at this point that there is no fix that Volkswagen can make to these vehicles that would achieve both the emission standards and the onboard diagnostics requirements that apply to these vehicles as they were certified. And so one of the options we can potentially look at is whether or not we would allow something less than a fully compliant fix on the roads. And that's a very serious thing for us to consider, because not only does it have implications for emissions on the road going forward, but it also has implications for our programs. You know, some of the comments that you made about the importance of making sure something like this happen again, well, it's predicated on making sure that there are real and very serious consequences to these types of actions. And so any precedent that we set with regards to our programs and our enforcement in this case is very, very important for how we would deal with future situations like this in the future.
Presumably, that would be reflected in the penalty stage when you get to part 4 of your outline, because you're talking compliance and fixing was the second, and then it ratchets up. Senator Allen.
There was a moment in your comments where you mentioned a black mark, and I couldn't tell if you meant, so you mentioned a black market. I couldn't, did you mean a black mark, or are you talking about a black market for technologies to?
No, sorry, it's just a black mark on the industry.
Okay, black mark, okay, all right, thank you. Because I was thinking, I started to get very imaginative and think that there would be a black market of people trying to, you know, get these kind of technologies to beat the system, but.
No, we have enough problems without having to create a black market.
Senator Roth.
So these engines that we're dealing with were manufactured in 2009 and after, the 2 liters?
Yes.
You know, I think it's great that you were taking all these after-the-fact actions and focus on penalties, but, you know, the other part of, I think, your job is to do some inspection and testing on the front end. So if you had used one of these PEMS devices to do on-the-road testing of these 2-liter engines in 2010, for example, is it likely that this diesel defeat device would have been detected? And if not, why not?
If it was available in 2009, I'm not sure that we had any. I'm pretty sure we didn't have any.
You said you had them for 4 years.
It was 20, yeah.
Okay, well, let's start with 2012 then. I should have asked my question differently.
Okay, well, if we had PIMS in our laboratory, first of all, as I mentioned, there's over 3,000 executive orders issued a year. Probably 1,000 of those are light-duty engines, vehicles. We cannot test all of them. Attaching PIMS to a vehicle, running it on the road for an extended period of time is very labor-intensive and not cheap. It takes a lot of staff time and equipment.
But it only takes one if this is a manufacturer's attempt to defeat an emissions device on an entire fleet of cars utilizing a 2-liter engine.
But you'd have to guess which one was going to actually cheat. So,
I mean, which manufacturer?
right, and on which vehicles. In other words, the diesel vehicles for Volkswagen maybe make up 15% of their fleet. The other 85% are gasoline cars. Okay, and that's just Volkswagen. And we have GM, Chrysler. So the 66,000, as an example, the 66,000 vehicles between 09 and 15 and the 2 liters we're talking about, that's Volkswagen's diesel population. In the same time period, there were between 12 and 13 million new cars sold in the same time period.
What percentage of the light vehicle diesel engines were manufactured by Volkswagen as opposed to another manufacturer? Pretty substantial, wasn't it?
Well, let me see if I have.
And certainly in 2012.
I mean, there's other ones.
I guess my point, and I'll cut to the chase and let somebody else ask. It seems to me that you've been entirely too focused on the penalty phase of your operation and not focused on the prevention phase. And penalties are great, except we now have 66,000 vehicles on the road that are polluting and dumping junk into the atmosphere. And had you used the technology that was available, at least in 2012, to do a sample testing on the road of these 2-liter engines, my guess is, the answer to my question is likely that you would have detected the diesel defeat device, knowing that it's diesel, and we had a 1998 issue with truck diesels. You would have detected it, and we could have taken these vehicles off the road 4 years or 5 years or maybe 6 by the time we get around to it off the road earlier. And so I guess that's my point. And I guess it's not a question, it's a statement, but I don't understand from the testimony when these PIMS devices were available, if not in 2012, at least in 2013, when Europe does it and Europe detects it before we do it, and we spend a lot of money on your agency and the air pollution rules and enforcement in California, why we can't find these things out before somebody else does. And that's a question somebody's going to have to answer sometime, somewhere. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, I just would note that US EPA didn't catch it, or any of the other air boards in the 50 states too. I mean, we think we are the best, right? So there's, I guess the question is that at some time we caught it, right? This may not have ever been caught.
After Europe
Yeah.
told us that they caught it using a PIMS device that we have that we don't use. Is that right, Mr. Chair?
And Chair Wojciechowski and Senator Roth, just for clarification, I think this is important, and my colleague Annette Hebert mentioned this. The technology, the PEMs were developing. I mean, your point is, were they become progressively more commercialized the last few years? That's absolutely true. But what was discovered in Europe, this is an important point, was not verification of an enforcement case, was not verification of a violation. It was suggestive. Now, your point, Senator, it's a good point. Basically, it's the question that we should all ask, which is there's several redundancies in the testing program, both up front and on the road. But the first question is the fair one, which is why wasn't it discovered? Well, when the suggestive data, and it was really European that suggested, because you can see higher emissions on the road in a compliant vehicle, because when you test a vehicle in the lab, you're testing over different cycles, and depending on how that vehicle is operated on the road at any instantaneous point in time, you can see higher emissions. So the fact you see higher emissions is not proof of a violation. Now, depending on how high they are, and these were high for certain points in time, it was suggestive. The suggestiveness ultimately led to a whole range of other tests, including lab tests. We constructed other cycles that the vehicle wasn't designed to recognize. That's part of it too, is how many cycles and do you develop new ones over time. But fundamentally, Senator Roth, your question about the role of PEMS, and that's just one element. It is not the solution in total. It can't be. Lab testing is part of it. OBD interrogation is another. But going forward, do PEMS play a greater role? I think they do. And I think do we acquire additional PEMS units and do some focus testing, particularly on applications for certification that may raise some questions? I think that's the right question, and I think that's the question that we are looking at as we should in terms of how can we further strengthen the program.
Senator Bell.
I look at the options that you have as a public agency, and I want to caution against creating moral dilemmas in terms of your actions. Accepting a lower level of pollution is one of them. Maybe selling or asking them to buy back the cars if they're subsequently going to be sold somewhere else where the cars meet some lower standard. That's another moral dilemma. Can you comment on that particular issue? Like, so if we ask them to buy back the cars and then they just take them and go off and sell them some other place that has, in the world or whatever, that has a lower standard than we have here?
Yeah, I mean, I guess
I'm talking about more or less a moral dilemma. So I think we have to look at moral dilemmas here when we talk about this a little bit. And
I think definitely, I mean, you're correct. There are moral dilemmas in some of the decisions that we're potentially looking at having to make. You know, one option, if there were to be a buyback, for example, those cars could be crushed. Another option is that those cars could be fixed and resold. We would have to figure out what.
Guarantee that, no.
How would we guarantee that? Well, it's actually, there are ways we have through our incentive programs and such. When we've done car scrap programs, it's easy to ensure the vehicles are scrapped. The issue is, not whether or not we can monitor it. The issue is whether or not it makes sense. And, we're here trying to figure out what's best for the environment, and our agency is not a consumer agency, but it is in our minds in terms of what's best for the innocent consumers that bought these vehicles in good faith. And so there are dilemmas, like you said, and we're going to have to balance those in the context of trying to settle this case, and that's one of the things that makes it a challenge. And I think we're very interested in your opinions with regards to those in terms of where you think we might need to fall.
Well, I think if somebody of limited income stretched their dollars to buy one of these vehicles, just talk about that a little bit. For me, they're at a disadvantage when it comes to the legal machinations that take place in complex cases where they're going to have to wait for a long period of time to receive any kind of benefit out of any or compensation for having bought a defective vehicle. I think that's to me a question. You have to look at how does it affect somebody that needed a car to get to work, and they bought the car. They thought it would be a good car. They were very concerned about air pollution. They want to make sure that it met those standards. They, in good faith, paid money for it. And then all of a sudden, they're being told that their car is defective. They may not get a vehicle registration in California or maybe some other else where they move to, some other state or country. When if they attempt to resell it or something, the value is devalued. I mean, even if it's fixed, it's going to be worth less. I mean, I would expect it would depreciate. We just let this kind of thing happen. I mean, so I think there's, how do we respond to protect the consumer from any of those types of things? I think that would be something that I would, reflect on and advise you to reflect on from that standpoint. I think the simplest way is to have the company say, we made a mistake, we want to buy back all the vehicles as quickly as possible, let's facilitate that, we will buy them all back. That would be the simplest. Would you say that if you wanted to eliminate these moral dilemmas, what would be the option that would best do that?
Let me take a stab at that, Chair Bell. And part of it is, and it's really embedded in your comments and your counsel to me, which is really important. One is the principle that was made for Volkswagen will cover those emissions. Whatever that outcome is, they need to cover those emissions looking back as well as forward to the extent that there are any looking forward. The other, and it's a key point that you and others have raised, which is the fact that the consumers, these people bought clean cars. In fact, they were advertised as clean. They actually took additional steps. They didn't do anything wrong. Volkswagen is the one that committed fraud here. And any resolution needs to look at the principle of consumer choice and options. My colleague Todd Sachs mentioned a principle in terms of certain consumers want to keep their cars. They're very happy. The cars are running fine. That's not the issue. And some of them are perfectly happy and are going to want to keep them going forward. A key point would be that ought to be an option. Others, they want another vehicle. So the point in terms of the counsel you provided to keep in mind any follow-on discussions, I think is at the core of the ultimate outcome. And ultimately, kind of your counsel to Volkswagen in terms of step up and fully take care of their consumers. Ultimately, that's what we want to see happen. But we're going to have to see how it plays out going forward.
To me, financial issues are one thing, but I think the moral dilemma will hang over this as long as we don't have a solution. It will not bode well for the state of California or Volkswagen at all if this drags out, because as it drags out, people will be harmed, in my opinion. People will be harmed further, in my opinion. It will not facilitate an easy settlement, I think, if things drag out. It will harm the correct thing that we should do if things drag out. So I believe that accepting responsibility and dealing with it as quickly as possible would alleviate, we can't just look at this as a financial problem. We should look at this as a moral dilemma in a bigger ethical sense. And I don't want to harm Volkswagen or anything like that. As a company, I'd like to see them continue to make clean cars. I'd like to see them to produce the best possible value for the consumer and be successful at that. And I think that's what I'd love to see. I don't think that they're going to be able to tell people that they're doing that as long as this hangs over people and they don't resolve this. I think the people will question whether or not they're being sincere if they don't solve this problem as quickly as possible.
Whatever happened to Farvig-Nugan? We were all happily driving around. Senator Leno, you had a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure if I should be asking you this question or if it's a question for the Department of Justice, but what authority does the state have to make sure that those who are in decision-making positions will pay the price for their actions of knowing and willingly deceiving consumers, the state, the environment? I would agree with Senator Bell that a large corporation like Volkswagen, and I've seen some astounding figures of the percentage of German workers who are associated directly or indirectly with Volkswagen, it's an enormous number. But there are ways to make them mitigate, as you've already mentioned, the damage they've done comprehensively. But one thing we see far too seldomly, I think, in our criminal justice system is those who are making the decisions paying any price. I've seen it across the board on Wall Street. Do you know what authority we have, what legal options we have to actually put people in prison for a crime they've already admitted they've done? Not just make a corporation mitigate and pay a price, but the individuals who made these decisions, which not only, I think, would give all of us, including our constituents, a sense that justice has been done, but also would, I think, communicate clearly to any other corporate executives out there, no matter what the industry they may be leading, that they could find themselves behind bars as well if they were to continue in ways that are less than legal and moral.